The screen opens with the sound of static. A military radio crackles, voices half lost in interference. The camera pans across a mountain outpost, dust swirling under floodlights. The hum of generators vibrating against canvas walls. Soldiers move in and out of a crowded command tent, their faces drawn with exhaustion. Amid the noise, amid the tension, there is one figure who seems out of place. A woman in fatigues, her sleeves rolled, kneels beside a battered satellite communications array. Tools spread neatly beside her. Grease marks her hands. Her eyes stay locked on the wires, tracing them carefully as she adjusts dials and reconnects circuits. She doesn't look like someone built for war. She isn't carrying a rifle. No combat patches crowd her uniform. Most assume she's just a comms tech, a specialist brought in to keep the satellites alive. But tonight, a single word will unravel her disguise. A word that will bring back the ghosts she buried, the skies she once commanded, and the respect of men who never knew who she truly was. That word is ma'am. Her name was Elena Rodriguez. To the soldiers around her, she was quiet, efficient, almost invisible. She rarely joined conversations, never sought attention. She worked while others talked, stayed behind while others went forward. But there was something in her presence, an edge in her stillness that few could place. She had once been a pilot, not just any pilot, but one of the Air Force's most decorated fighter captains. She had flown through storms of fire and steel, guided squadrons into hopeless battles, and pulled men out of certain death. Her call sign was Phoenix. Her reputation was whispered with awe. And then she disappeared. No one knew why. No one asked. Now she was back in uniform, but hidden in plain sight, serving as a communications officer, keeping satellites alive so others could carry out the fight. That evening, tension ran high. A Ranger team was pushing deep into enemy territory. Their mission depended on reliable comms, and the satellites had failed. Inside the tent, frustration turned to panic. Where the hell's our comms tech? A sergeant barked, slamming his fist against the table. We're blind out there. The room buzzed with curses and angry voices. Elena rose quietly from her corner, picked up her toolkit, and walked forward. She didn't speak. She simply knelt by the array, her fingers steady, even as the soldiers around her fumed. For 10 long minutes, she worked. Circuits hissed. Lights flickered. Sweat rolled down her temple as she recalibrated power, swapped faulty lines, tuned frequency dials with surgical precision. And then clarity. The satellite array snapped alive, clear and strong. Team Bravo in position. Came the sharp voice of a Ranger leader. Awaiting orders. The room exhaled as one. Relief washed over them. Elena leaned back, exhaling softly. She wiped her hands on a rag, gathered her tools, and prepared to fade back into the shadows. But before she could leave, a voice cut through the air. The word rang like a gunshot. Every head turned. An Army Ranger lieutenant stood rigid, his eyes fixed on her. And then, in front of everyone, he raised his hand in a crisp, perfect salute. Silence fell. Soldiers froze. Confused glances darted around the room. Why would a Ranger lieutenant salute a comms tech? Elena stopped mid-step. Her back stiffened. Slowly, she turned to face him. Their eyes met. Recognition flickered between them. The lieutenant's voice was steady, but heavy with memory. Captain Rodriguez. A ripple ran through the room. The sergeant who had barked at her earlier blinked in disbelief. Captain. Elena's throat tightened. She hadn't heard the title in years. She had buried it, locked it away with everything that came with it. But here now, in this dusty mountain tent, the past had found her. The lieutenant lowered his salute, but kept his voice respectful. You don't remember me, but I remember you. Operation Thunderstrike. The skies were burning. Anti-aircraft fire everywhere. And we thought we were finished. And then his voice cracked slightly. Then you came flying that jet like it was alive. You saved us, ma'am. You saved my team. The soldiers whispered among themselves, stunned. Elena closed her eyes for a moment. Thunderstrike. Yes, she remembered. The night sky lit with artillery trails, her jet dodging and weaving through storms of fire. The night she refused orders to retreat. The night she dove into chaos to protect men trapped on the ground. She opened her eyes, her voice low. That was a long time ago, but the lieutenant shook his head firmly. Not for us. We never forgot. And seeing you here, working quietly like none of it ever happened. His jaw tightened. With respect, ma'am. You're more than the radios. You always were. The tent was silent. Elena stood straighter, though her heart pounded. Memories she had tried to bury clawed their way back. The deafening roar of engines, the flash of explosions, the screams over the comms, the moments when she knew she wouldn't make it back and somehow did. But along with the victories came the ghosts, the faces of those she couldn't save. The weight of command, the cost of being Phoenix. She had left the skies because she could no longer bear that weight. She had chosen silence over glory, shadows over light. And yet, standing there with a ranger lieutenant saluting her, with a room full of soldiers staring in awe, she felt the truth she had long denied. She had never stopped being Captain Rodriguez. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. The men treated her differently, not with pity, not with awe, but with a deeper respect. They asked about her missions, her jet, her call sign. Slowly, piece by piece, the legend of Phoenix resurfaced. She told them of the night missions, the desperate escorts, the time she flew until her hands bled against the stick. She told them of the brothers and sisters she lost, and why she had walked away. But more than her past, they saw her present. A woman who chose to serve again, not for medals or recognition, but in silence, ensuring no soldier was left cut off, no unit left in the dark. One night, weeks later, the Rangers stumbled back into camp after a brutal mission. Their uniforms were torn, their faces streaked with dirt and blood, but they were alive. The satellites had carried them through. The lieutenant found Elena alone in the tent, adjusting equipment for the next day. He walked over quietly, holding something in his hand. Without a word, he placed it in her palm. A battered Ranger tab patch, frayed from combat. For when you forget who you are, he said simply. Elena stared at it, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. For the first time in years, she let herself smile. Not the quiet, polite smile she used with strangers, but a real smile full of life. The screen fades slowly to black. Her silhouette lingers in the mind. Stronger than medals, louder than speeches. Some heroes don't seek glory. They don't walk with their medals on display. They hide in silence. They fix satellites. They keep the lifelines alive. But their courage never fades. Respect them. Remember them, because behind every quiet figure there may be a story that once shook the skies. Private Chun and Corporal Williams watched from across the communications tent as Elena methodically calibrated the satellite array's primary dish alignment. The woman they had dismissed as just another technician now commanded their attention in ways they couldn't fully understand. There was something different about her movements, a precision that spoke of training far beyond standard communications protocols. Chun nudged Williams, his voice barely above a whisper. Look how she handles that equipment, like she's done this under fire before. Williams nodded slowly, studying Elena's steady hands as she traced complex wiring patterns without referencing technical manuals. Most techs need the schematics open constantly, Williams observed. She's working from memory, like those systems are part of her DNA. The two Rangers had begun to notice details they'd previously overlooked. The way Elena positioned herself with clear sight lines to all exits. How she automatically tracked aircraft movements overhead, her eyes following flight patterns with professional interest. Her posture was different too. Not the casual stance of support personnel, but the alert bearing of someone trained for combat situations. These weren't the mannerisms of a communications specialist who'd spent her career in rear echelon positions. Elena sensed their scrutiny, but didn't acknowledge it directly. She'd grown accustomed to hiding in plain sight, to being underestimated and overlooked. For years, anonymity had been her protection, allowing her to serve without the weight of expectations that came with her reputation. As she fine-tuned the satellite dish's elevation angles, fragments of Operation Thunderstrike flickered through her memory. The desperate radio calls from Rangers pinned down by overwhelming enemy fire. Artillery rounds exploding around their position, each impact cutting their communications further. She remembered the decision that changed everything. Orders had been clear: maintain safe distance, provide air support from established patrol routes. But the Rangers were dying, their position being overrun while she flew predetermined patterns miles away from the real fight. Elena had broken protocol that night, diving her F-16 through walls of anti-aircraft fire to reach the trapped ground team. For 43 minutes, she danced between surface-to-air missiles and artillery bursts, providing close air support that kept the Rangers alive until extraction arrived. That decision had saved 12 Rangers, but cost Elena everything she'd built in her military career. The after-action reports had been brutal, focusing on her violation of direct orders rather than the lives preserved. Her superiors couldn't publicly discipline a pilot who'd prevented a massacre, but they made sure her career trajectory flatlined. Elena finished the satellite alignment and checked signal strength readings on her portable monitor. Perfect clarity across all communication channels, exactly what the mountain terrain demanded for reliable contact with forward operating teams. As she packed her equipment, Sergeant Major Torres approached with a stack of requisition forms. "Rodriguez," he said, his tone respectful but curious, "I've been reviewing your personnel file. Your technical skills are exceptional, but your background seems thin for someone with your capabilities." Elena met his gaze steadily. "I've been doing communications work for several years, Sergeant Major. Experience counts more than paperwork." Torres nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with the answer. Military personnel files told stories, and Elena's file read like pages had been deliberately removed. The conversation was interrupted by urgent radio traffic from Team Alpha, currently operating in a valley 15 miles east of FOB Alpine. Their primary communications had failed during movement through difficult terrain, leaving them dependent on backup systems with limited range and reliability. Elena listened to the broken transmissions, automatically analyzing the signal degradation patterns. The terrain was causing multi-path interference, while atmospheric conditions were introducing additional complications. Standard troubleshooting protocols would take hours to resolve, time the Rangers didn't have. Without waiting for orders, Elena began reconfiguring the satellite array's parameters. She adjusted power output, modified frequency bands, and implemented signal processing techniques that weren't part of standard operating procedures. Within minutes, Team Alpha's transmissions came through with crystal clarity. Torres watched her work with growing amazement. Those modifications weren't in any technical manual he'd seen. Elena had solved complex communication problems through intuitive understanding of radio wave propagation and atmospheric physics that suggested advanced training far beyond basic communications courses. "How did you know to make those specific adjustments?" Torres asked. Elena paused in her equipment checks, weighing her response carefully. "You learn things when lives depend on reliable communications," she said simply. "Experience teaches lessons you can't get from textbooks." The following evening brought another crisis that would test Elena's carefully maintained anonymity. Team Bravo had encountered unexpected enemy resistance during a reconnaissance mission deep in hostile territory. Their extraction point was compromised, communications were failing, and enemy forces were closing in. Elena monitored the deteriorating situation from the communications center, listening to increasingly desperate radio calls as the Rangers fought to reach alternative extraction coordinates. The mountain terrain was wreaking havoc with their communications, creating dead zones where contact was impossible. Colonel Martinez, the FOB commander, paced behind Elena's workstation as fragmented transmissions painted a picture of Rangers under heavy fire. "We're losing them," he muttered, frustration evident in his voice. "Can't get reliable comms through those mountains." Elena studied the topographical maps, calculating radio wave propagation paths through the complex terrain. The standard communication protocols were inadequate for the Rangers' current position, but there were alternatives if someone understood advanced radio frequency management. "Sir," Elena said quietly, I can establish reliable contact with Team Bravo. Martinez turned to her with desperate hope. How? The terrain is blocking everything we've tried. Elena began implementing modifications to the satellite array that went far beyond standard procedures. She reconfigured multiple systems simultaneously, creating a communications network that compensated for terrain, masking, and atmospheric interference. Her fingers moved across control panels with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed similar operations under extreme pressure. This wasn't theoretical knowledge from training manuals. This was practical expertise gained through real-world experience where communication failures meant death. Within 15 minutes, Elena had established crystal-clear contact with Team Bravo. The Rangers' voices came through the speakers with startling clarity, reporting their status and requesting immediate extraction from their current position. Martinez stared at Elena with a mixture of amazement and suspicion. Those modifications you just made? Where did you learn those techniques? Elena continued monitoring the communications link, ensuring stability while the Rangers coordinated their extraction. Advanced communications training? Sir, she replied without elaborating. Martinez wanted to press further, but the immediate crisis demanded his attention. Team Bravo needed extraction coordination, and Elena's communication network was their lifeline. As the night wore on, Elena maintained perfect contact with the Rangers throughout their movement to the extraction point. Her technical innovations had turned an impossible communication scenario into a routine operation, saving lives through expertise that shouldn't exist in a standard communications technician. Colonel Martinez couldn't shake his curiosity about Elena's capabilities. The next morning, he placed a secure call to Personnel Command, requesting Elena's complete service record. What he received raised more questions than answers. Captain Elena Rodriguez's file was surprisingly thin for someone with her demonstrated expertise. Basic training records, standard communications courses, routine assignments to rear echelon positions. Nothing that explained her advanced technical knowledge or her calm under pressure during crisis situations. Martinez studied the documents carefully, noting gaps in the chronology that suggested classified assignments or deliberately omitted information. Military personnel files were comprehensive by design, documenting every aspect of a service member's career. Elena's file felt sanitized, scrubbed clean of anything significant. Meanwhile, Elena continued her routine maintenance of the satellite communications array, unaware that her commanding officer was investigating her background. She worked methodically, checking system parameters and ensuring optimal performance for ongoing operations. Private Sean approached her workstation carrying a technical manual thick enough to serve as a doorstop. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "I've been trying to understand those modifications you made last night. I can't find any reference to those procedures in the official documentation." Elena glanced at the manual Sean was carrying, recognizing it as the Standard Communications Handbook issued to all technicians. "That manual covers basic operations," she explained patiently. "Real-world situations require adaptive thinking beyond standardized procedures." "But how do you know which adaptations to make?" Chun persisted. "Those frequency adjustments you implemented, the signal processing modifications, they worked perfectly, but they're not taught in any course I've attended." Elena paused in her work, considering how much to reveal. "Experience teaches lessons that classroom instruction can't provide," she said finally. "When communications failures mean people die, you learn to find solutions quickly." Her response satisfied Chen's immediate curiosity, but it also reinforced his growing conviction that Elena possessed training and experience far beyond what her personnel file suggested. He wasn't the only Ranger reaching that conclusion. Sergeant Major Torres had been quietly observing Elena's work patterns and noting details that didn't fit the profile of a standard communications technician. Her situational awareness was exceptional, her technical knowledge encyclopedic, and her composure under pressure suggested someone accustomed to life-or-death situations. That afternoon, Torres encountered Lieutenant Jackson, the same officer who had saluted Elena days earlier. The two men found themselves discussing Elena's mysterious background and impressive capabilities without directly stating their shared suspicions about her true identity. The moment of truth came during the evening briefing when Lieutenant Jackson finally connected the pieces that had been nagging at his memory for days. As Elena worked quietly at her communication station, something in her profile triggered a flood of recognition. Jackson's mind raced back to Operation Thunderstrike, to the night his Ranger team had been surrounded by overwhelming enemy forces in a remote mountain valley. Anti-aircraft artillery had filled the sky with deadly fire, making close air support seemingly impossible. He remembered the F-16 that had appeared through the chaos, diving through walls of explosions with suicidal precision. The pilot's voice over the radio had been calm, professional, utterly fearless as she coordinated devastating airstrikes that saved his team from annihilation. That voice. Jackson stared at Elena, his memory crystallizing with startling clarity. The same calm tone, the same precise diction, the same unshakable composure under extreme pressure. Captain Elena Rodriguez wasn't just a communications technician hiding at FOB Alpine. She was Phoenix. The realization hit Jackson like a physical blow. Elena Rodriguez was the legendary fighter pilot who had violated direct orders to save his team, the pilot whose career had been destroyed for choosing lives over regulations. She was the woman whose heroism had been buried in classified files to protect military careers. Jackson stood slowly, his chair scraping against the tent floor. Every conversation in the briefing area gradually faded as Rangers noticed his sudden change in demeanor. Elena continued working at her station, unaware that her carefully constructed anonymity was about to evaporate. "Ma'am," Jackson said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet tent. Elena looked up from her equipment, meeting his gaze with calm curiosity. Every Ranger in the briefing area turned to watch the exchange, sensing something significant was about to unfold. Jackson's hand moved to his brow in a sharp, precise salute. "Captain Rodriguez." "Phoenix." The words dropped into the silence like grenades, exploding Elena's world of careful concealment in an instant. A collective intake of breath rippled through the assembled Rangers as the legendary call sign registered in their minds. Phoenix. The pilot whose exploits had become whispered legend among ground forces, whose name was spoken with reverence by survivors of impossible missions. Elena's carefully maintained composure cracked for just a moment, her eyes reflecting the pain of a past she had tried desperately to leave behind. Then she straightened, accepting the recognition she had neither sought nor wanted but could no longer deny. The tent remained frozen in stunned silence as Elena slowly rose from her workstation. Years of carefully constructed anonymity dissolved in the face of Lieutenant Jackson's recognition. She had run from this moment, hidden from this truth, but there was no escaping it now. "You don't remember me," Jackson continued, his voice thick with emotion, "but I was Sergeant Jackson then. 3rd Squad, Alpha Company. We were pinned down in that valley for 6 hours. Thought we were all going to die." Elena closed her eyes, the memories flooding back with painful clarity. The desperate radio calls, the coordinates passed through static-filled transmissions, the sight of muzzle flashes blooming like deadly flowers across the mountainside as Rangers fought for their lives. "Then you came," Jackson's voice cracked slightly, "flying that F-16 like it was part of you, diving through artillery fire like it was nothing. You saved 12 lives that night, ma'am. Every single one of us made it home because you refused to abandon us." The other Rangers listened with growing amazement as Jackson recounted details of Operation Thunderstrike. Elena's impossible flying, her precision strikes against overwhelming odds, her willingness to sacrifice everything for soldiers she'd never met but refused to abandon. Elena opened her eyes, looking directly at Jackson for the first time since he'd spoken her call sign. "That mission cost me everything," she said quietly, her voice carrying years of suppressed pain. "My career, my reputation, my future. Command couldn't court-martial a pilot who saved lives, but they made sure I'd never fly combat missions again. The weight of command, she continued, meeting the eyes of Rangers around the tent. The responsibility for every decision, every life hanging in the balance. You carry that weight until it breaks you, until you realize you can't save everyone no matter how hard you try. Sergeant Major Torres stepped forward, his expression combining respect with understanding. Ma'am, you didn't lose your career. You traded it for something more valuable. You traded it for our lives. Elena felt tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed for years, threatening to surface. For so long, she'd viewed Operation Thunderstrike as the end of everything she'd worked to achieve. She'd never considered that the Rangers she'd saved might see her sacrifice differently. But you're still serving, Private Chun observed quietly. Still keeping communications alive, still making sure soldiers don't get cut off from home. You never really stopped being Phoenix. You just found a different way to save lives. The transformation in the tense atmosphere was immediate and profound. Rangers who had barely noticed Elena before now looked at her with a reverence reserved for living legends. But more than awe, their expressions carried genuine gratitude and deep respect. Colonel Martinez, who had been investigating Elena's background, entered the tent to find his communications technician surrounded by Rangers hanging on her every word. The sight confused him until he caught fragments of conversation about fighter jets and impossible missions. Phoenix, he heard someone whisper, and suddenly Elena's mysterious expertise made perfect sense. Martinez had heard whispers about Operation Thunderstrike, classified reports of a pilot who had single-handedly prevented a massacre through unauthorized heroism. Elena found herself telling stories she had buried for years, speaking about missions she had never been allowed to discuss officially. She described the weight of flying alone into hostile airspace, knowing that ground forces were counting on her precision to survive. The night missions were the worst, she explained, her voice steady but haunted. Flying through mountain valleys in complete darkness, navigating by instruments while enemy fire lit up the sky. You know that one mistake, one moment of hesitation, means soldiers die. Corporal Williams leaned forward intently. How did you handle the pressure, ma'am? Knowing that lives depended on every decision you made. Elena was quiet for a long moment, considering the question that went to the heart of military leadership. You accept that fear is part of the job, she said finally. But you don't let it paralyze you. You train until your responses become automatic, until you can function despite the fear. And you remember that the soldiers on the ground have no choice but to trust you completely. Lieutenant Jackson nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his eyes. That's why you're here now. Still serving, still making sure we have reliable communications. You never stopped protecting soldiers, ma'am. You just changed the battlefield. Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the guilt and regret she had carried for years. She had viewed her transition from pilot to communications specialist as a defeat, a diminishment of her value as a soldier. But seeing it through the Rangers' eyes revealed a different truth. Sergeant Major Torres approached with something in his hand. Ma'am, he said respectfully, the boys wanted you to have this. He extended a worn Ranger tab patch, its edges frayed from multiple deployments and combat operations. For when you need to remember who you are, Torres said simply, echoing words Elena had heard before in different contexts. Elena took the patch with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of acceptance and belonging it represented. Elena held the Ranger tab patch against her palm, feeling its rough fabric worn smooth by countless hands and harsh conditions. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to smile genuinely, not the careful expression she used to deflect attention, but a real smile that reached her eyes. The days following her recognition brought unexpected changes to life at FOB Alpine. Rangers who had previously walked past her workstation now stopped to ask questions, seek advice, or simply acknowledge her presence with respectful nods. Elena found herself becoming an unofficial mentor to younger soldiers. Private Chin approached her with technical manuals and communication problems that stretched beyond standard procedures. Elena patiently explained advanced concepts, sharing knowledge gained through years of experience in high-stakes environments where communication failures meant death. You see, Chun, she said while demonstrating frequency modulation techniques, the manual gives you basic procedures. But real situations require you to understand the principles behind those procedures. When you understand why something works, you can adapt it to any situation. Her teaching style was different from formal military instruction. Elena didn't rely on memorization or rigid adherence to doctrine. Instead, she encouraged creative thinking and practical problem-solving, lessons learned through years of making life-or-death decisions under extreme pressure. Sergeant Major Torres noticed the change in Elena's demeanor as she embraced her role as Phoenix once again. The quiet, almost invisible communications technician had been replaced by a confident leader who commanded respect through competence rather than rank. "Ma'am," Torres said during one of their evening conversations, "you're having a real impact on these young Rangers. They're learning things from you that no classroom could teach." Elena nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the truth in his observation. "I spent years hiding from who I was," she replied, thinking that my past failures meant I had nothing valuable to offer. But maybe experience, even painful experience, has its own worth. Maybe the lessons learned from mistakes are just as important as the lessons learned from successes. Colonel Martinez had been quietly observing Elena's transformation and its effect on his Rangers. Their communication skills had improved dramatically, but more importantly, their confidence in handling complex situations had grown measurably. Elena's influence extended far beyond technical training. During the weekly briefing, Martinez addressed Elena directly. "Captain Rodriguez," he said, using her rank publicly for the first time, "I'm recommending you for assignment to the Ranger Training Brigade as a communications instructor. Your expertise is too valuable to keep hidden at a forward operating base." The mountain sunset painted FOB Alpine in shades of gold and crimson as Elena stood beside the satellite communications array she had maintained with such quiet dedication. The equipment hummed with perfect efficiency, its signals reaching across valleys and peaks to connect isolated Rangers with the lifelines they needed to survive. Colonel Martinez's offer of a training position represented everything she had once dreamed of recovering. Recognition, respect, the opportunity to pass on hard-won knowledge to future generations of soldiers. It was a chance to step back into the light after years of deliberate obscurity. But as Elena watched the sun disappear behind the jagged mountain peaks, she realized something profound had changed in her understanding of service and sacrifice. The quiet years at communication stations, the anonymous hours ensuring soldiers stayed connected to home and headquarters, had taught her lessons that flying combat missions never could. Lieutenant Jackson found her there as darkness settled over the base. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "the whole unit wants to thank you. Not just for Operation Thunderstrike, though we'll never forget that, but for everything you've done since. For keeping us connected when connection meant survival." Elena turned to face the young officer, seeing in him the same dedication she had once carried into hostile skies. "Jackson," she said thoughtfully, "do you understand why Phoenix was my call sign?" He shook his head, curious. "The Phoenix burns itself to ashes, then rises again transformed," she explained. "I thought my career burned to ashes that night in Thunderstrike. But maybe that wasn't destruction. Maybe it was transformation into something different, but equally important." She gestured toward the communication equipment that had become as familiar to her as any aircraft cockpit. Flying fighters was about projecting power, about being visible and dramatic. But this work, keeping communications alive, connecting people across impossible distances, that's about preserving life in ways that never make headlines. Jackson nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in her words. "So you're staying with communications, ma'am?" Elena smiled, the expression carrying years of hard-won peace with her choices. "I'm staying where I can do the most good," she replied. Training new instructors is important, but there are plenty of qualified people for that role. There aren't many who understand communication systems the way I do. There aren't many who've learned to see the connections between technical expertise and saving lives. As the mountain air grew cool around them, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought her from the cockpit of an F-16 to this remote communication station. The path had been painful, marked by loss and disappointment, but it had led her to a different kind of purpose. Some heroes seek the spotlight, she said quietly, more to herself than to Jackson. Others choose to work in shadows, keeping the vital systems running that allow heroes to exist. Both kinds of service matter. Both kinds save lives.